Hello everyone, this is my presentation for CSP 815, Ethical, Legal, and Professional Issues in Counseling. And the topic that I'm going to be discussing today is grief and bereavement counseling and the ethics involved with that. So, what is grief counseling? Now, normally with grief, grief is a life process that most people are going to experience at some point. Um, and Grief is essentially the process that we go through in order to accept loss in some way. And normally, what this is a healthy, natural process that doesn't necessarily require any professional help. However, there are some situations in which someone does need to come in for professional assistance in order to overcome or better process their grief and bereavement. Um, and so, because this is going to be something that's going to come up at some point as a counselor, it's going to be very important for us to have some competency in this kind of counseling. So, a big question on that is going to be, what does competent counseling look like in grief and bereavement? Um, there has been a lot of research and there has been a lot of literature that's been published on the subject. Probably one of the most familiar names when it comes to grief and bereavement is Dr. Kubler-Ross. Dr. Kubler-Ross published a book called On Death and Dying, and I believe another one on death. And these are some pretty big pieces of literature that kind of started the process on helping us better understand the grief and bereavement. So if you have not looked at or checked out that literature, I certainly suggest you do so at some point, because having that under your belt in terms of in additional knowledge is something that's incredibly useful. And with Dr. Kubler-Ross, he goes over certain subjects like what the grief cycle looks like. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and essentially mapping out what the general ideas behind all of these. Now, normally she's rather vague about these things, and understandably so, because everyone does process grief in their own way. And this comes out in a lot of different ways, because everyone's belief system is different. The way that they end up processing loss is going to be considerably different as well. The way that we process loss is going to be affected largely by gender, cultural background, age, and even just like other belief systems that we have. Say someone who is a outright atheist is going to have much different ideas about the death and dying process as compared to someone who is very religious. And so we're going to have to be able to understand and be able to work through both of these processes, even though the belief systems on both ends of these may be considerably different. And understandably, say a 90-year-old is going to have a different idea of the death process and the grief process compared to, say, a 6-year-old. And again, we as counselors may be tasked to be able to help both of these people on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so what necessarily does that mean in the terms of counselors and being able to bring something to the table? As counselors, we're pretty much going to be there in order to help them process through those things. If someone does come in because of grief and bereavement issues, they may need some help with some of the different steps in being able to go through that process. There's something called persistent grief or non-finite loss. And what can kind of happen in these situations is that there may be some hangups or something that doesn't allow grief to take its natural process in being able to work its way out on its own naturally. Some of the things that can kind of happen in this is especially if someone is, say, disenfranchised by their grief, or um, the grief process is outright is like continual. Um, in a situation like this, someone may not have even died yet, and there's just almost like kind of a purgatory in terms of like we don't really know what's going to happen or when it's happening, and real world events may actually end up playing a pretty big role in stopping that grief process. And so we may have to be able to go in and help them in whatever ways we can to be able to help them go through that process completely. And one of the big things that kind of comes up in with this is when someone's disenfranchised by grief, uh, it essentially means in one way or another their feelings aren't necessarily validated, and so someone can have an increasing amount of guilt, or there may be a lot of despair or shame, or say there's even a lot of different family conflicts. These are going to be some things that are going to really kind of stop that process, and if a person isn't able to really progress through, they're almost perpetually in a stage of grief, and they're almost frozen in that process wherever it is that they are. And so hopefully we can loosen up the gears on that, so that can continue. Um, and when I talk about grief, I guess another important thing to kind of think about is when we talk about grief, it's grief is the process of accepting loss, right? Uh, but this loss doesn't necessarily even have to have happened yet. A great example of this would be the book Tuesdays with Morrie. If you've read it, it's a fantastic book. This is the process of someone going through the grief, going through the grief process, and the person hasn't even died yet, but they're preparing for their own loss. Or even in the terms of the writer, it's for the book, he is preparing for a loss that hasn't happened yet as well. And so um, that's one of those things that we can kind of keep in mind as we look at the death and dying process and grief and bereavement is we're focusing on the perception of it rather than the actual events, because um, the client's phenomenology is going to be at the core of what we're going to be working at. Now, when I say the phenomenology for the client, uh, as a therapist, we're going to try to get to the core of what they are thinking, feeling, and experiencing. And we're going to get into the shoes of um, how they are interpreting and seeing the world. And that means, as a counselor, with us walking hand in hand with them through that process, we're going to be handling some pretty heavy hitting emotions and some pretty big ego defense mechanisms. And again, going back to say Dr. Kubler-Ross, she even kind of talks about that a little bit. You know, one of the first stages of grief is denial, and that's just an ego defense mechanism where we end up just kind of blocking out very, very painful things just for the sake of our own well-being. And so, as a counselor, we have to, one, be aware of these things, but also, two, be able to kind of, in a way, disconnect from some of those things as well, and understand that our thoughts and feelings and emotions are separate the from the client. Because again, these are going to be some pretty heavy-hitting emotions. These are going to be a lot of really big. Uh, it's a pretty big event in someone's life. And oftentimes, because it is such a big thing, the idea of death, there's a lot of times when we may have kind of our own hangups that we need to kind of deal with as well. But I'll get back to that a little bit later on. With the idea of defense mechanisms with our client, though, we're going to have to really be able to understand that these things are going to come out and be able to handle them appropriately. And kind of going over some of another theorist, Valiant's work, you're going to kind of see a nice range of mature and any immature defense mechanisms that may come out with this client as well. And again, we have to be competent enough and we have to be knowledgeable enough to know what to do with those things and to make sure that we aren't really taking this personal, because this isn't really about us. And one of those other ego defense mechanisms that we may end up seeing is this client of ours who is going through all these really, really heavy emotions may end up projecting all of these things out onto us as a therapist. And so we have to be able to identify and separate from that as well. So that means that we're going to be walking a pretty tight line, or a thin line here, because not only are we going to be expected to walk hand in hand with these people or these clients through this process, we're going to have to be able to still keep ourselves separate enough so we don't have enmeshment in the client situation as well, because we still have to worry about our own well-being. We still have to be able to stay objective to some sense, because we are the professionals here and we have to be able to maintain that. So uh, two almost seemingly very opposite ideas on the opposite end of the spectrum: be with the client, but also stay professional and stay uh, well, still have our emotional separation from the client, but we can still understand where they're coming from. And so going through that process is going to be expecting a lot of you as a client, or you as a therapist, as we continue through this. And so another big thing as a therapist, for us to be able to ethically do this, we're going to have to understand what some of our own hangups are. Kind of like what I was saying before, death is a pretty heavy thing, and it's a very common thing in the terms of life events. This is something that you are going to experience just like our clients, and this is going to be something that very likely is going to end up coming up at some point in session. That means that we're going to have to be able to separate our business from the clients. And this isn't always an easy process, and it's something that we do have to be aware of. We are not going to be the perfect therapist. We are not going to be able to completely be aware of when these things are happening, but at least we can build some of those basic competencies so we know what's happening. And we are able to um, maintain an appropriate demeanor and be effective for the client through this process. Because if we do have our own hangups with death anxiety, or if we're still working through our own bereavement, we may end up turning the session into our own counseling session and working through our own issues, when quite simply that's not what we're there for. We have to be there for the client. We have to put our own our own stuff on hold so we can be complete for the client and be able to go in the directions that the client needs us to go with them. And so understanding what our hangups are, understanding uh, what our needs are in the terms of that, we need to be able to know and be aware of what those are beforehand, so we can take effective measures on that. And we're all going to have those things. We're going to have blind spots. A blind spot is essentially when there is some unfinished business in, say, my own life. If I have unfinished business, I am going to I may have difficulty going there. I may have difficulty discussing some of those things. So if I have a loved one in my own life that is going through, say, chemotherapy or something like that, and a client comes in and they have grief and bereavement with someone who is in a very similar situation, I may not be mentally ready or emotionally prepared to go in a direction like that. And so I may even unconsciously want to go somewhere else. And that somewhere else may not be where the client needs to go. And so I have to be able to be aware of that as a therapist, as an ethical therapist, and be able to understand what my limitations are in this aspect and be able to refer this person out if I can't overcome them on my own. and understand that I am owning this, and this is something that I need to be able to work through at some point in order for me to be the best therapist that I can for my clients. So, one of the big things that we're going to have to ask ourselves is, how do we increase our awareness? And so, that's going to be one of those self-exploration things that we're going to have to do. A great thing that we can do to gain that awareness is do some self-reflection, understand what it is that I'm thinking and feeling about death, and be able to work through some of those concerns during supervision, or even get some of our own counseling. Death is usually a very, very uncomfortable subject for a lot of people, and those are going to be those things that we're going to have to be able to overcome, even in the best of situations. But hopefully we can do that. And so, as an aware counselor, we're going to have to be able to help that client through that process and help them understand and label their personal feelings. And we're going to also have to be able to step back and understand what our feelings are about the situation as well. I have to know, as an ethical counselor in bereavement, I have to know where the client's emotions start and where mine end. And I have to be able to make that separation. And I have to have that understanding that they are not the same thing. Because again, if I become very much enmeshed in this and I take on some of those emotions of the client, my effectiveness as a counselor may end up becoming compromised because of that. As an aware counselor, I'm going to understand the personal values and the influences that the counseling relationship have on the client, and how these personal values are affecting me as a counselor. Again, I may not see completely eye to eye as to what is happening with my client, but I have to be able to understand that even though I don't agree with everything, I can still help them through the grief process in their own way. And like I was saying before, emotions are going to come out quite a bit. Ego defense mechanisms are going to come out quite a bit. And I am going to have to be able to effectively identify when those things are coming out. Someone who's going through grief, they're going to be experiencing a lot of pain, and they may project that as anger or sadness onto us as a therapist. And we're going to have to be able to do something positive with that. But before we can really do that, we have to understand that they are lashing out, or that they are reacting in a way that's putting emotions onto us. And to be able to find a positive resolution with that, and hopefully find something that does help the client work through some of those unresolved issues. And probably one of the biggest things is, as professionals, we're going to have to be able to build some very good goals, and we're going to have some knowledge and be able to build on the strengths and limitations of this client. And so, when we talk about grief counseling and doing this ethically, it's a pretty big, well, it's a big shoes to fill, essentially. But we can do this, right? Even if you don't plan on being a grief counselor specifically, this is going to come up at some point, and you are going to need some basic proficiency in this to at least make your way through this situation when it does arise. It doesn't have to be the bulk of your clients, but at the very least, we have to have something there to help them process it, and refer out if it's something that's too big for our britches. Something that's going to be able to help us through this is there is something called the Association for Death Education and Counseling, and this association is the Thanatology Association, and it has a code of ethics, and a lot of it really does look like the code of ethics for the ACA, and this is going to be something that can guide us into understanding, or guide us into helping us know what we can do as therapists to be helpful for someone through the grief and bereavement process. I believe that is everything that I had to cover for this. I do have a handout that I'm going to be turning in as well, and hopefully you guys thought of this as something that's useful. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed.